In mountain communities like ours, people often ask if you've read the advisory or tell you about a slide they heard about in the forecast that morning. And those phrases, the advisory, the forecast, suggest that there's one advisory, one forecast, that is somehow this thing that's fixed and immutable, incontrovertible. But there's a lot of choices that go into the products that forecasters like myself and my team issue every morning. Some of those choices are pretty obvious, like what the danger rating is going to be for a day. Others are more subtle, like how we format and present the information, what order we present it in. And what comes from that is, while we think those products are all the same, it turns out that they often mean different things to different people, that in fact, some people may understand the same thing differently. How do those choices sway how people perceive information? How does the forecast format influence how people apply it? Dr. Pascal Hagley and his team of graduate students have been investigating those questions for the last few years. Dr. Hagley is an assistant professor at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver. That's the Vancouver in the land we can no longer visit, but haven't forgotten. All right, that's British Columbia. He holds the NRSAW Industrial Research Chair in Avalanche Risk Management at that institution. He's been asking thoughtful questions about snow and avalanche for the last 15 or so years. He's authored and co-authored numerous papers on everything from airbag effectiveness, computer visualization of snow profile models, and the effectiveness of snowpack tests for recreationists. For inspiration in the snow and avalanche world, Pascal lists Werner Munter and his team of students. He prefers extended columns for when recreating and propagation saw tests when doing research, and he claims to have no preference between powder and corn. He'd take a day with moderate danger over a persistence lab hazard over a day with considerable hazard, storm slab instabilities. His presentation tonight, New Insights into How Recreationists Use and Understand Avalanche Forecasts, is one result from 3 years of qualitative and quantitative studies examining how backcountry users' skills, practices, and perceptions of avalanche forecasts matter and change. The goal is to develop evidence-based ideas that help organizations like the Flathead Avalanche Center improve avalanche safety products. Pascal, over to you.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Blaise. And welcome everybody on the call here. Thanks for tuning in. It's a great pleasure to be part of this event tonight. And so I'm going to take the next 25 to 30 minutes to basically give you an overview of the research that we've recently been conducting about how recreational users understand the bulletin. So let me share my presentation with you here, and then we'll get the show on the road. Now, my master's student, Henry Finn, actually had the pleasure to be part of the North Rocky SAW last year. So you might have already heard a little bit about this research. But we're actually been active over the last 12 months, despite COVID. And so we have quite a few results to share with everybody. Now, as we all know, the job of avalanche forecasts is to summarize the information about the current conditions in a way that recreationalists can make informed decisions about when and where to go into the backcountry. A lot of the research in our community aims to help produce better forecasts, but the focus of our research is to better understand what end users actually do with this information. And so the big challenge for avalanche forecasts is that our audience is highly diverse with different backgrounds, objectives, and skills for putting the available information together into action. And so there's many different ways that forecast products are and can be used. So our overarching research questions are: how do recreationalists use, understand, and apply the bulletin information? Does the provided information match with users' needs and expectations? And what are common hurdles and challenges? And so our goal is to produce results that can highlight opportunities for making avalanche forecasts more accessible and more useful for everybody. Now, to address these research questions, we have been using a range of different social science methods. Initially, we conducted qualitative interviews to get an overview of different forecast user types. And in the last 2 winters, we ran large-scale online surveys to get a more complete picture of how backcountry users use avalanche forecasts in North America in general. So at this point, I would really like to thank the American backcountry and avalanche community for participating in these surveys. You've given us an unbelievable data set that gives us a lot of different opportunities to explore interesting questions. So right up front, really a big thank to all of you. Now, the rich data set that we got from you has been the foundation for an entire series of studies. At last year's SAW, my student Henry already talked a little bit about Anne Sinclair's Avalanche Bulletin user typology and his own research on Avalanche Bulletin literacy. If you want to learn more about their results, both Anne and Henry have recently published short articles in the Avalanche Review, and you can also check out their full master theses on our website at avalancheresearch.ca. In this presentation, I'm going to talk more about the work of Abby Morgan, who aims to identify challenges with the danger scale, and Katie Fisher's study, which aims to look at whether different presentation formats can make avalanche problem information easier to use. So let's get started with Abby's work on the danger scale. Now, by design, the avalanche danger scale is not a linear scale, but an exponential scale, similar to the scales used for other natural hazards like earthquake or hurricanes. The chart on the right, which was recently published by Jörg Schweitzer and his colleagues, shows the amount of avalanche activity in a small but well-monitored forecast region as a function of the local danger rating. The number at the top indicates how many forecast days are included in the box plots for each level, which nicely shows the nonlinear increase. As we go up on the scale, the difference in the avalanche activity increases, giving the curve a concave shape. Several other studies have shown similar trends, and Bruce Tremper actually talks about this aspect of the danger scale in his book. Now, having an accurate understanding of the nature of the avalanche danger scale seems critical for making informed choices about backcountry travel. And so we were therefore curious to learn more about how recreationalists actually perceive the scale. So to examine people's perception of the danger scale, our 2019 survey included a question with sliders that allowed participants to indicate what range of severity they associate with the different levels. 0 represented no avalanche hazard at all, and 100 represented widespread, large natural avalanches reaching valley bottom. So each participant basically gave us 5 ranges with an upper and lower bound, so 10 data points in total. Now for the analysis, let's rotate the sliders by 90 degrees so that our chart has the same orientation as the figure from Jörg Schweitzer. As an example of possible answers, the pattern you see on the chart right now represents evenly spaced ranges with no overlap. In total, we had just about 2,700 participants providing us with their assessments. And what you see on the chart now are the distributions of the ranges from the entire data set. So to analyze the data, we used a so-called latent class linear mixed effects model, which allowed us to fit regression lines through these data points to extract how people perceive the danger scale. We included both linear and quadratic terms to allow that regression line, that's a straight line on the chart right now, to also curved shapes, even curved upwards or curved downwards. Now, the really cool thing about this modeling approach is that it can group participants according to the similarity of their regression lines. So this allows us to identify distinct clusters of participants who perceive the danger scale in a particular way. What you see on this slide are the 7 distinct patterns that in Avalanche danger scale perception that Abby and I identified in our analysis. Each pattern is characterized by typical ranges for each danger rating level and a regression line that goes through the center points of each range. We don't have enough time to go into the details of each of these patterns, but let me just highlight the big picture. Roughly half of the participants view the danger scale as a linear scale with evenly spaced and non-overlapping ranges. Another 25% of the sample also views the danger scale mainly as linear, but the ranges are wider and overlapping. In the pattern 4, the one on the left, the range of considerable is substantially wider than the other ranges. Another 20% of the sample perceived the scale to have a convex shape with the distance between the levels decreasing as we go up on the scale. And only 6% actually drew a convex shape, similar to what we see in Jörg Schweitzer's chart. To better understand what drives these perceptions, we examined the characteristics of participants who ended up in these different groups. Turns out that days of backcountry travel per year, which we interpreted as engagement in backcountry activities, is the most important driving factor. Participants who spend more than 50 days in the backcountry each winter have a significantly lower proportion of the basic linear pattern and a higher proportion of the linear pattern with the wider range at considerable. Avalanche awareness training was less important, but had a similar effect. The last factor was experience, with more experienced folks having a higher proportion of people who perceive the danger scale as having a convex shape. Interestingly, people who perceived the danger scale correctly as concave didn't exhibit a specific user profile. They weren't more trained, more engaged, or more experienced, or anything else. They were rather a random group. Now, perception is one thing, but even more important is how recreationalists integrate the danger rating into their trip planning process. And to examine this question, we straight up asked participants how they use the danger rating level. And we gave them 4 different response options. They could say, at this danger level, I go primarily based on the danger rating. I go mainly based on the danger rating, but I also check other information. At this level, avalanche problems and the forecast details are the basis of my decision to go. And the last option was, at this level, the danger rating alone prevents me from going into the backcountry. In total, we had almost 2,500 participants completing this question. And the stacked bar chart that you see on the left provides an overview of the complete sample. Some of the key observations include that 91% of participants stay at home at extreme based on the danger rating alone, and 62% of participants stay at home at extreme and high based on the danger rating alone. At the other end of the spectrum, about a third, 32%, go into the backcountry at low, primarily based on the danger rating alone. And 5% do the same thing at low and moderate. Now, similar to the analysis of the danger scale perception question, we were curious whether there are distinct patterns in how people responded to these 5 questions. So our latent class analysis here classified participants' response patterns into 5 distinct groups. The first 2 patterns represent about 60% of the entire sample. Stay at home during high and extreme. The left group relies a little bit more on the danger rating than the group on the right. The patterns in the bottom row are very similar to the patterns in the top row, with the exception that these folks rely on other bulletin information to make the decision whether to go into the backcountry or not under high. The 5th pattern here is a bit of a special case and outlier where people rely primarily on the danger rating under both low and moderate. Similar to the danger rating perception analysis, it is primarily the days of backcountry travel per year that determines which of these patterns participants belong to. Participants who go out less than 10 days a winter are more prevalent in the first 2 patterns, whereas participants who go out more than 20 days or more are more prevalent in pattern 5. Again, avalanche awareness training is only a secondary importance, with more highly trained folks being more prevalent in the pattern at the bottom, in the bottom row. Interestingly, the danger rating perception doesn't seem to matter at all in how people actually use the danger scale information. So to wrap this part of my presentation up, here are some of the main take-home messages that I take away from this analysis. We saw that most people perceive the danger scale to be linear, which is different from how avalanche researchers look at it. Interestingly, avalanche awareness training did not make a difference in how people look at the scale. We also saw that about 2/3 of participants simply stay at home when the rating is high or extreme. So they don't distinguish between those 2 levels. Interesting here is that how people perceive the scale doesn't seem to affect how they use it to make basic trip planning decisions. Now, what are we going to do with this information? I think the next step will be to work with both avalanche centers and educators to figure out what these results exactly mean for us. For me, the big question is, does the danger scale do the best possible job communicating the conditions to the user that rely on that scale the most? Let's move on to Katie's study, who's currently looking at how the presentation of avalanche problem location information affects people's ability to use this information. To examine this question, we conducted another online survey last spring, where we gave participants bulletin scenarios with 2 avalanche problems and asked them to rank the provided routes according to their exposure. We presented the location information in 3 different ways. In the Canadian style, with elevation and aspect information in separate graphics. In the US style, with each problem presented in a separate aspect elevation rows. And in a new style, where all the information was combined into a single graphic. Participants were randomly assigned to one of these 3 presentation formats, and each of them completed 4 ranking tasks with different routes and avalanche conditions. After they completed the rankings, we also asked participants about their personal preferences for the different presentation formats. In total, slightly over 3,000 people participated in our survey. Again, a great showing from the American community. And they completed roughly 12,000 ranking tasks. So a very substantial data set. We then used a number of regression analyses to isolate the effect of the presentation format on whether people got the ranking task correct, how long it took them to complete the task, and how much they liked the different presentation formats. So how did this work out? To make the results tangible for you, I'm presenting the calculated performances based on the regression parameters for the different graphics, holding all the other model parameters constant. So when looking at these numbers, you should primarily focus on the differences between them and not necessarily the absolute values themselves. So let's look at the chance of completing the ranking task correctly first. So everything else being the same, the chance of completing the task correctly was roughly 8 percentage points higher for participants who were presented with the American graphic. There was no significant difference between the Canadian and the new graphic. So here we have a clear winner in this category. With respect to completion time, participants presented with the American and the new graphic were roughly 10 seconds faster than if they were given the Canadian graphic. We take this result to mean that combining the elevation and aspect information takes considerable mental effort, whereas combining the information from the two different problems is much easier. So here we have two winners, and the Canadian graphic is a distant third. In our analysis of preference ratings, we found several interactions, which means that how people like a graphic depends on the interplay with other variables. So for example, Americans really liked their own graphic, whereas Canadians liked their graphic equally well as the American, but overall at a lower level. Which graphic participants used during the root ranking exercise also mattered. Overall, participants liked the American graphic the best, but the difference was smaller among participants who used the other graphics in the exercise. Finally, we found an interesting pattern with Avalanche training. Again, the American icon was consistently rated highest by all training levels, but the preference for the new graphic depended on participants' training levels. Participants with less training liked it more, and participants with professional level training liked it considerably less. So overall, again, the American graphic is clearly the most preferred. So let's briefly summarize these results. The American graphic is the clear winner as it outperformed the other graphics in all aspects. The race for second was tight, but the new graphic prevailed due to the faster completion times, which we interpreted as it being easier to process. Another important result of our analysis is that people generally like what they're used to. So if you're planning to change the information presentation of your forecast, you should probably be ready for some resistance from the users. Now, these results probably mean that we have a little bit of work to do here in Canada, but more generally, I think it highlights that design really matters and that research like this can really help to make our products easier to understand and help people make better decisions about when and where to go into the backcountry. Now, before I wrap this up, I want to quickly touch on the value of interactive exercises. A general observation we've made in our surveys is that participants perform well on knowledge questions, but they have a much harder time combining information into assessments or decisions. Now, this is not necessarily surprising, as making meaningful decisions requires continuous practice and feedback. But getting this feedback is actually quite difficult because, as we all know, it is possible to get away with bad decisions in avalanche terrain for a long time. The comments we get in our surveys really highlight that participants like our exercises and they seem hungry for these types of training opportunities and feedback that tells them whether they get things right or not. Now, while recreationalists typically take 1 or maybe 2 avalanche safety courses in their backcountry careers, they interact with forecasts every time they plan a trip. And I therefore think that avalanche forecast websites have tremendous potential for avalanche awareness education if we look at them as more than just a conditions report. I think meaningful interactive exercises could provide recreationalists with potentially condition-dependent training opportunities, and at the same time, offer forecaster with almost real-time information about whether users are getting the message they're trying to convey. Now, I hope you enjoyed this whirlwind tour of our latest research on avalanche risk communication. There's quite a bit more, and we're still in the process of analyzing some of this, and I was unable to sort of pack everything into a meaningful presentation for an evening. Thanks again for taking the time to participate in our surveys. I know they're quite long and quite involved, so I really appreciate it, because it's really, your participation is key for helping us better understand who you are, what works for you, and even more importantly, what does not work for you. So it wouldn't be possible to do this research without you. We will continue with our research in this area, so stay tuned for more results and requests for participating in future surveys. And remember that you don't have to be an expert to participate in our studies. We really want to hear from everybody. Also, thanks to all the different agencies that helped in the funding, design, and promotion of our surveys. And if you have any questions about these studies or my research program at Simon Fraser University in general, feel free to email me, or you can check out our website at avalancheresearch.ca. So thanks a lot for listening, and I'm happy to take questions if there are any.
Great. Thanks, Pascal. Fascinating. It's amazing what you can learn when you have so many respondents giving such great detailed survey answers. I'm going to turn the mic over to Dr. Eric Peitsch, who's going to run our mediated question and answer session. Eric's been instrumental in a lot of avalanche programs in the Valley, and he's currently working as a research physical scientist for the USGS in West Glacier. You can either ask questions in the Q&A box or raise your hand, and Eric can make you live. So Eric, over to you.
Thanks, Blaise. Thanks, Pascal. That was an excellent presentation. And I've seen it a couple times now, but it's great every time. So thanks for that. While we wait for folks to type in their questions in the Q&A or raise their hand, and folks, please don't be shy. I'll just start with a couple here. So first of all, it looks like the U.S. swept with gold in all of your categories. So when will Canada be adopting the U.S. graphics?
That's a great question, and I don't have any control over that. I mean, the study was funded mainly by Avalanche Canada, so they were exactly looking for this type of observation. And over the last 2 years, they redesigned their back end, and they wanted to get ready to sort of make choices about how to redesign their front end. So I think they will. I'm confident that they will look at this research in detail and make their choices accordingly. So it was also interesting because I had a lot of professionals fill out this survey, and some of the comments that came back sort of personally, not directly in the survey, was that they realized how difficult it actually was to work with the Canadian icons. So it was a nice little reality check.
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting comparison nonetheless. So yeah, that's great work.
And we're not the only ones who have aspect and elevation separate. So the Swiss actually also have it this way, and so it's really it's a clear win for the US.
So sort of along those lines, we have a question from Jason. You just mentioned about the Swiss having a similar graphic, and so his question is, what do the Europeans think of the models, or I guess of the results?
Of the results, I haven't had the opportunity to present it directly to them. We presented some earlier results about our sort of bulletin user types and a Henry study about bulletin literacy, and there was generally a lot of interest. I think we're all, as a community, we're starting to understand that snow science is one part of this, but really sort of bridging that gap between the bulletin and the end user is important. And so people have been very interested in our research, and I'm currently in conversation with the Tyrolean Avalanche Warning Service to conduct a similar study there. And it will actually be interesting to see whether we see similar patterns there.
Sure. Yeah, I'll be interested to hear what they as well down the line. We have a question from Roland. He asks, in Abby's analysis, she showed the go, no-go choices based on danger ratings. And his question is, were participants asked about terrain management in their decision process?
Yes, they were. So the question there was very specific about the trip planning. And then in the next question that followed up, for people who said that they would be going out, mainly or heavily based on the danger rating, we then presented them with photos of different terrain to figure out, well, what terrain do you think is appropriate under that rating? Now, the idea was good. Our execution of the survey was suboptimal. And so our data set there is not all that informative. So it's definitely a gap that we have there, and we'll be sort of filling in that gap in a better way in one of the upcoming studies. But yeah, we tried to do too much in that initial survey, and so we made some mistakes. But an excellent question, because it's definitely like, it's where the rubber hits the road afterwards. So
right, yeah, exactly. Great. We have a question from Chris, who says, first, thank you. And he said, in your initial charts, he's asking, were the data normalized in any way based on terrain choices for different danger levels, or was it based solely on go, no go?
So I assume he's talking about the same question that we were just talking about, sort of how you use the danger scale to make your initial trip planning decision. And so it was Yeah, it was the straight up answers
Okay.
about those questions. So there was no normalizing going on in there.
Sure. Okay. So I've got another question here. In terms of what this means for Avalanche education in general, and I guess sort of a sub question there is, how can we get sort of, one of the things you looked at was the number of backcountry days that folks had under their belts. So how do we get folks with less days to basically use more than just the danger rate? You sort of alluded to this earlier in the Q&A here, but how do we get them to dive deeper into the bulletin or the advisory?
Yeah, that is a good question. I think our approach so far has been to trying to better understand what these different levels are and what information they use. And we are now sort of trying to dig into, so we've come up with these hierarchies or levels. And now as the next step, the idea would be to look at differences between these steps and what are the moderators to help people go up in that ladder. And to answer your question is we haven't looked at it yet. I think we have some interesting data set that we can do that, but we haven't looked at it yet. So,
sure.
Yeah.
Okay. We have a question from Jennifer, and she asks, has there ever been a consideration to include an interactive map as part of the forecast that shows danger ratings overlaid on a map, which would correspond to slope, aspect, and elevation to help individuals with their trip planning?
Yeah, that's a good question, and that suggestion comes up quite a bit. And we generally shy away from it for the reason that so currently we have these aspect elevation roses that sort of are an abstraction of the terrain that's out there. And in some way that abstraction sort of highlights that these are just general patterns that we expect. Now, if you sort of put this on a map and you start coloring in specific slopes, it gives the reader sort of a sense that this information is actually more precise than what it actually is. And so I think that's why avalanche forecasting centers generally sort of shy away from just like putting stuff on a map. But there's often sort of, let's say, backcountry and computer enthusiasts who come up with that idea and create some app and so on. And so I often end up with that in that conversation of like, yeah, you can do that, but what are you actually communicating with that? And so I'm quite cautious about that. And there is actually a study in Sweden that was probably done about 6-8 years ago, when all these sort of rule-based decision methods came out, where they developed a little smartphone app, and they had the maps on there, and they tracked people in the terrain both with and without these maps. And it showed that people who had maps with avalanche terrain information actually skied more aggressively along the line between, let's say, blue or let's say green and red terrain. So they use those maps to sort of like, how far can I push it? And that's really not the information we want to pass on. So I think that abstracted terrain is actually a very good presentation of what the information is intended to, and how precise is that information. Nevertheless, I think we can help people to make that step from that information representation to then actually put it onto the terrain themselves, I think. And that's really what sort of the motivation behind our study was. How easy can we make that step?
Sure. Great. We have a question from Kira, and she says, it's interesting how education could be interactive in addition to the forecast, as you suggest in your presentation. She's asking, any ideas on how this would be structured? Are we catering to beginners and experts?
That's a very good question. And I can't tell you at this point, but I've definitely been in touch with a number of forecast centers and also educators like ARI, for example. We're really thinking about like, well, how could these exercises be structured? ARI actually and Avalanche Canada took some of our exercises and now implemented them in some teaching material and in some online quiz. So I think we would have to be thinking very carefully about how these things are designed. So there's lots of opportunities for future research, but I think it will be sort of a community effort. Like as researchers, we have a specific skill set that we can provide here, but there's lots of Avalanche course providers out there who probably have creative ideas of what they think would work with the students they have. So we're totally open to hear what people think about this.
Yeah, excellent. I think there's certainly lots of potential there. Let's see here. We have a question from Jason, and let me interpret this a little. How often our local forecast center issue a danger rating as opposed to a high danger rating shape how we see the danger scale? And is there any way to figure that into how people perceive the forecast?
So is the question like, what is the sort of temporal distribution of danger ratings? Like how often are different danger ratings called?
Well, I think we're getting at, what he's asking is sort of the number of times a local forecast center issues a low danger rating and then at the other end, higher extreme. Yeah. And how does that shape how we see the danger scale?
Well, I think that's a very good question. And it's certainly, I've certainly thought about this a lot now. What do these results mean? So we have people, a good chunk of the people treating high and extreme the same. They're more on the, let's call them lower end users without any judgment, but they're lower end users who rely more on the danger scale. And so they treat these two levels the same. And they basically look at it as a linear scale. And so the question is, well, are we really doing them a favor by having these two levels at the top? First, extreme is rated very rarely. And a study from Switzerland from Frank Teckel recently showed that those extreme ratings are actually wrong most of the time. So we're not very good at that level. We don't get to do it often, so we don't have a lot of practice. So there's reasons for that. But so are we really doing the people who need the danger scale the most? Are we doing them a favor by having those two levels? And so now if we got rid of that level, that extreme level, how would that change the scale? So now then suddenly considerable is from, and if we keep looking at it as a linear scale, it moves from 40 to 60 up to 50 to 75. And so people probably will naturally perceive it as a more serious conditions than how it currently looks like. And I think that will probably be going in the right direction. now changing the danger scale is a very big topic, and I'm not necessarily advocating for it because there's a lot involved with the change. But I think it's a useful question to ask ourselves. Does the scale do what we need it to do? And would some modifications like that, like would the benefit outweigh the loss that we have? So yeah, this is a question that I mean, our goal was to contribute to that conversation, but it's a very big conversation. And I'm looking forward to having that with a lot of different avalanche forecasting centers. But yeah, I think it's an excellent question. So.
Great, thanks. Question from Blaze. He's actually asking, is there any correlation between typology and how people used the forecast?
So there was no correlation between the typology and how people perceived the scale. So it was really, yeah, that was just somewhat random. There's a close correlation to that second question in terms of how people, like how they use the danger scale for their trip planning process. And we initially had that typology in our analysis, but it overrode everything else. So then it was just the typology. And so then we realized that that question actually indirectly asked people about what kind of bulletin user type they are. And so it was kind of like we were doing the same thing twice, which is very nice on one side because it really sort of validates that user typology. And on the other side, we can now think, well, could we use that simple question to actually identify what people, what users are? Because eventually we could also think of like that people could have like accounts on Avalanche forecast websites, and they could be presented with the information in the format that fits most with their user type. And so we could use that as sort of screening questions to classify people initially. So yeah, so there's a strong relationship there.
So who are the 9% that go out during the extreme?
Yeah, those are yeah, those are some outliers. I can't tell you from the top of my head what the exact what the exact profile was there, but they were basically, yeah, kind of like probably like the bulletin is not telling me when and where to go. I can make that choice myself. Another interesting pattern there was that fifth pattern that I sort of just glossed over of people who go based on the danger rating alone, basically out in low and moderate. And the interesting pattern there was that the main distinguishing factor there was country. And so it was more Canadians in that pattern than Americans, which I don't really have a good explanation for, but it was interesting. Like it was consistent that it was the Canadians who had a higher percentage in that pattern. So we've noticed a few other areas where country played a role, and I had some conversations with Ari and some of the Canadian Avalanche course providers to better understand how potentially differences in Avalanche awareness curriculums would be responsible for these differences. So I think there's some interesting questions to pursue there, and potentially sort of the two different communities learning from each other.
I've got another question here from and he asks, how do you think the danger scale could better reflect low frequency, high consequence events or scenarios, and how could we better communicate risk for those situations?
Yeah, and yeah, it's kind of that middle ground there in the considerable, where we have
Sure.
different types of combinations of likelihood and consequence. I think my view on this is that we probably can't pack more stuff into the danger scale. It's a simple scale that apparently people naturally look at it as a linear scale. And even there, I think that like one approach will be to teach people more that it's an exponential scale, which I think is a bit of an uphill battle. Like they will just look at it linearly, and we should just somewhat accept that and design the things around accordingly. But to get back to the question, like I think people who have enough understanding to know that there is these different combinations, we can communicate that type of information in the avalanche problem information in the forecast details, and people will find it there that are able to manage the risk at that level. And so I think we should really sort of think about, well, who is really depending on the danger scale, and sort of design it for that audience. And that's why I think that potentially combining the high and extreme is beneficial, even though some people, and I'm in that, like to me, it makes a difference whether it's high or extreme. But I always read the rest of the forecast anyway, so I will find out about that subtlety in that information. I don't need the scale for that. It's convenient to have it in the scale for me, but if it prevents other people who need the scale more from using it in a meaningful way, I'm happy to give that up. So I think, to cycle back to the question, I think we have to think hard about what is the scale exactly for, and we can probably not overload it.
Yeah. I've got another question here. Based on the users sort of between countries, do you think there was an influence from travelers, backcountry travelers in the US who are perhaps, more used to seeing a variety of graphics? In the US, of course, not all Avalanche centers have the same platform and setup. Do you think there's any influence there in terms of preference from folks from the US versus folks from Canada? Of course, for the unified
That's an interesting question. Yeah, I mean, I don't know how that affected people. We do have information about sort of participants' home forecast center, if you so want. So we know what graphics they would have had there. We didn't look at this in detail. I wonder whether these results indicate that the American forecast centers should also somewhat
exactly
synchronize their graphics. Yeah, so it's an interesting point, and I might go into the data and actually look at that, whether that made a difference.
Yeah. Well, we don't seem to have any other Q&A on the list here, but yeah, I think we might wrap up the questions then, if unless anybody has anything. Last chance to get any questions in there. But I want to say thanks, Pascal, for your presentation. It's great. It's really just great work to be able to dive into this work, or into this topic, and really see what people are what people prefer, and how we're actually using the advisories. So thanks for this work.
Well, thanks for having us. It's a great pleasure to be part of this event and get the opportunity to share these results. And it's really been actually quite amazing doing this online. It's been very interactive and very good conversations. And so I think these events really been great. Have a great start to the winter, everybody, and everybody stay healthy and yeah, enjoy the great outdoors when other things are a little bit more difficult.
Absolutely, thanks. Up to you, Blaise.
Great. Thanks, Pascal. As usual, very thoughtful research questions, very thoughtful answers and comments. Certainly helps me to think a lot about our products.